Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome back to our Democracies at War lectures, chapter 7. We will have a look today at drone warfare, which permit targeted killings. It is the second innovation introduced by Western liberal powers to wage successful wars of choice. Overseas, we saw in our chapter 6, and the third innovation, that is to say, the transformation of Western armies from popular conscript armies to professional armies composed by professional soldiers, sometimes more or less supplemented by corporate warriors. And we saw that professional armies were introduced because of the quality, because of the skills of professional soldiers, as opposed to the quantity of conscript soldiers. The use of weapons technologically sophisticated requires skilled warriors, and professional soldiers, by definition, are likely to be more skilled than average citizens. And what's more, professional soldiers have a second advantage, a political one, because they permit Western governments to avoid any kind of public debate. Why? Well, for the very simple reason that citizens nowadays no longer have to fight. Let's come back very quickly to Immanuel Kant's thesis. According to Immanuel Kant, if democracies are likely to be peace-prone, it is because citizens hold their governments accountable. Now, citizens being rational individuals, they are not eager to go to war because they would have to fight, and as citizens, look at the quote, they would have to fight and they would run the risk of dying, and therefore they somehow prevent their governments, their elected governments, from launching a war. This postulate of Immanuel Kant obviously is no longer relevant nowadays, if indeed citizens are no more soldiers. I would like to quote Peter Singer, who I used in my chapter 6. According to Peter Singer, I quote, less than 0.5% of Americans over 18 serve in the active duty military. Less than 0.5%, that is to say, less than one American out of 200. Since they no more have to fight, Americans, well, have no reason, no rational reason to prevent wars from being launched. They have not even any reason of criticizing them or even of being interested in these wars. So Western governments are able to evict public opinion from any somehow serious check of the wars that they are launching. In today's chapter, ladies and gentlemen, we will have a look at the technological evolution. And here again, I would like to quote John Carg and Sarah Krebs, one of the books that I used to prepare today's lecture. The use of drones, the resort to drone warfare also, I quote, undermines both peace and a liberal democracy. The resort to drones undermines peace, that is to say, it favors wars. Why? Because it incites Western liberal decision makers to go to war rather than to look for a diplomatic conflict resolution. Remember, diplomacy and war are the two possible instruments of a state's foreign policy. They incite to go to war because their use permits to diminish the death toll of the wars that they are fighting. And they undermine democracy precisely for the same reason that we saw some minutes ago, that is to say, they shield the Western leaders from public debates because drones do not affect their citizens' everyday life. Once again, I would like to quote Kant, since imperial wars using drones are fought overseas, they leave no devastation behind in our Western states, in our Western societies, at least as long as there are no terrorist attacks, if we accept to consider these attacks as some kind of retaliation by Islamic or Islamist fighters to try to force the Western states to stop their interventions in notably Islamic states. We'll come back to this point in our chapter 11. If drones permit to wage wars which do not leave devastation behind, I quote Kant, then maybe to some extent, very last part of his quote, Western liberal decision makers can resolve on war as on a pleasure party for the most trivial reasons. They no longer somehow have to justify their decisions to go to war because of the absence of any impact upon the Western societies, the Western citizens themselves. Ladies and gentlemen, I am aware, of course, that the fact to claim that Western democracies have developed new technologies in order to wage successful wars. I'm aware that the fact to say that democratic policymakers look for means permitting them not to be attacked, controlled, criticized by their public opinion. I'm aware that these two claims somehow amount to posit that the Western liberal democracies' wars are a conscious undertakings, which somehow brings my analysis prospectively close to what we may call a conspiracy, a theory. So for my defense, if I may, I would like to emphasize one point, a kind of a personal point. I already told you, if not in this class, then in other classes, that social science, research in social science is not separated from the researcher's personal background, from his or her passions, beliefs, convictions, experiences. So when the Cold War came to an end, to a peaceful end all the more so, I took the idea of peace dividend seriously. I took George Herbert Bush, the father, George Herbert Bush's discourse on the New World Order seriously, and I took the democratic peace theory seriously. Why? Because to some extent it was a credible, rather than more or less utopian or Marxist, a critique of the very pessimistic realist outlook according to which international politics, by definition, takes place in a never-ending state of war. So I took the possibility of peace somehow seriously. And then I woke up, or I was woken up brutally by the Western states' behavior, and even more by their hypocritical discourse. We are peace-loving countries, etc. We saw this, and actually democracies are fighting wars. So I came to the conclusion that politics somehow, this is the case both for domestic and for international politics. Politics is basically about power, about domination, which is the classical philosophical conception of politics. Military force is an instrument used by states that are eager to dominate world politics. And this is the case whatever the regime of states. And to believe, try to believe something else is to be kidding myself. So I adopted this kind of critical scholars, very broadly defined, such as Martin Shaw, whom I already quoted too. Martin Shaw, according to whom critical social theorists now recognize war as an active project of states and militaries, an active project of states and militaries, which cannot be, I go on quoting, which cannot be explained away by structures, by ideologies, by interests. You know, Kenneth Waltz's explanation of wars occur because there is nothing to prevent them. This is the anarchical explanation. Anarchy, etc., explains why wars regularly break out. I do think that beyond anarchy, wars break out because some specific actors do consciously undertake them. War are active projects of states and militaries. It so happens that Putin is perceived to be about to launch his attack against Ukraine. So this is somehow active project. Or when saying that he's about to do so, well, we consider that he plans to do so. So why should it be different for Western democracies? After all, and we saw this now in chapter 4, Operation Iraqi Freedom was a very concrete, conscious implementation of a political program of the neoconservatives, among other American politicians and intellectuals, favorable to go to war. Anyway, let's come back to our topic today, drone warfare. The drones, the name drone, ladies and gentlemen, as such is significant. Why? Because, well, a drone originally is a male bee. And then we can posit that there are one or two links, elements common between a drone, that is to say, a male bee, and today's military drones. Two elements, I think, are common to both of them. First of all, the sound of a military drone is pretty close to the buzzing sound of a male bee. When flying, a male bee produces a specific buzz due to its wings, and the sound is somehow similar to the sound of a military drone's engine when flying in the sky. And the second common element is what we may call a kind of gender dimension. You know what happens, what a male bee is supposed to do is only raison d'être, his only function is to mate with a queen bee. And once this sexual intercourse has occurred, the male bee has no more utility within the hive. And logically, then it will be evicted by female workers, by female bees, the workers. This means that drones, male bees, are members of a hive that the hive can afford to get rid of. The male bees are beings that female bees can live without once the reproductive function assumed. And here then is the link with the drones, at least the first drones. The first military drones, when they were conceived of, also were considered to be dispensable. Let's therefore have a look at military drones, whose official names, you may know that, are unmanned aerial vehicles, UAV, or unmanned combat aerial vehicles, UCAV. There is a distinction between the two. We'll come back immediately to this distinction. Drones, military drones, are unmanned vehicles, well, for the very simple reason that they are without cockpits, and therefore without pilots, as opposed to aircrafts, to planes. That said, ladies and gentlemen, unmanned has a second meaning, and here is the gender dimension. Unmanned also means, or can mean, emasculated, castrated. And this connotation, this gender connotation, refers to the fact that drone operators precisely are not pilots. Pilots run the risk of being downed, or the plane is likely to be downed by surface air missiles in today's modern wars. That is to say, they risk their lives when bombing their target. This is not true for drone pilots to some extent, who are no more pilots strictly defined, and they therefore are no more heroes, manly mans. They are unmanned because they operate their drones from distance without risking their lives. To come back to last week's chapter, pilots in today's armies, aircraft, air bombers, air jets, pilots are the contemporary equivalent of the medieval horsemen, of the medieval knights who, on their horseback, ran the risk of being killed in the battle. So, unmanned also means post-heroic soldiers or operators. And as regards the dispensable nature of drones, it goes back to the original use of the very first drones, and I therefore have to go back to the history of the drone invention, the historical process at the origin of inventing the drone. Strictly speaking, drones, the origin of drones goes back to the invention of wireless technology. While radio-controlled engines remain in the eyesight of the human controller, drones are remotely piloted engines, or operated engines. The pilot or the operator operates outside, the drone, operates outside the sight of any human controller. And this technology first was experimented during World War II, when the US tested, not used, but tested aerial torpedoes that were launched against ships and that were remotely piloted by an operator looking at a television screen. So beyond the concrete eyesight of the controller. These drones then were used as torpedoes, that is to say, as missiles. A missile is something which is sent. The etymology of missile is similar to the etymology of, is the same as the one of missionary. A missionary is also a person who's sent somewhere, just as a missile is something which is sent or thrown against a target. So the first drones were torpedoes or missiles, and since they were launched, in this case against ships, they were destroyed in the process, which means that they did not survive once their mission fulfilled, just as male bees will be evicted and actually end up dying after mating with the queen. The Germans during World War II had their own drone project. The V1 rocket actually was not a rocket, it was a flying bomb, and it was precisely called buzz bomb by the Americans. So we here have the dispensable essence of drones, which also characterize the first unmanned vehicles, modern ones, that were developed after World War II, and whose design is pretty close to the ones that we know nowadays. These drones were target drones, escorting aircraft, military aircrafts, because they were used as dummies, as lures. And that is to say, the objective was to deflect the enemy's shooting from the real target, which was the aircraft. And the Americans used it when spying over the USSR, in the sky over the USSR during the 60s. in order to deflect, to divide Soviet missiles from American targets, from American aircraft. The same was true for Israelis in their October War, Kippur War against Egypt in 73, and all the more so against Syria, and the Palestinians when invading Lebanon, Operation Peace in Galilee in 1982. So the aim here was to deceive the enemy. The enemy confused the drones with the aircrafts, so downed the drone, which was the lure, and the real, the effective plane or aircraft could pursue its mission, that is to say, bomb the target that it was eager to hit. So drones, since they were downed as dummies, as lures, once again was sacrificed. We have here again the dispensable nature of drones. Next stage, ladies and gentlemen, drones were equipped with cameras, and they were used, notably by Israel, to spy as a device for observation, for detection, for surveillance of the Palestinians, notably in Lebanon. And these similar drones nowadays are used, for instance, by the US to control the Mexican border in order to intercept refugees, migrants, etc., that want to cross the border in Texas and New Mexico and Arizona. The next stage then consisted in creating the Predator, which is one of the very famous contemporary missiles. The Predator was invented in the midst of the 1990s. It was used in the war against Serbia in Kosovo during NATO's intervention in 1999. Operation Allied Force in Kosovo, that is to say, against Serbia. And these Predators were equipped with light and used to illuminate, to floodlight the buildings, the targets that then were hit by the bombs or by the missiles launched by American navies in the Mediterranean Sea. So these first drones were unmanned aerial vehicles, and then they became unmanned combat aerial vehicles. Why? Because they were armed. They were armed with missiles, and first and foremost, the very famous Hellfire missiles, carried first by the Predators and then by the Reaper. The Reaper, which replaced in the American Army some years ago in 2018, the Predator. The French Army, for instance, also purchased American Reapers for its Operation Barkhane, which is about to come to an end nowadays in Mali and in the Sahel region. So Reaper models are the contemporary most used missiles, drones, carrying missiles by the US Army. The Reaper, for instance, was used to kill the Iranian General Soleimani in Iraq. I think it was 2 years ago in January 2020. So nowadays, the drones we are more or less spontaneously thinking of are unmanned combat aerial vehicles. That is to say, they carry missiles which then they launch against their targets. Of course, combat drones, contemporary drones to some extent, are able to combine all the different tasks that they are able to undertake. They all at once get information and they attack, they launch missiles. And of course, since they launch missiles, they are no longer destroyed during the process. And so now there's kind of dispensable nature which characterized the first drones no longer is true as regards the more modern Reapers, the more modern offensive drones used to attack. They are projectile carrying drones. They are machines carrying missiles. They are not themselves torpedoes that are destroyed during the process. So these Reapers were notably useful. The first one was used in Yemen, and then their use was generalized, notably in Afghanistan by the Obama administration. I feel free to emphasize that Obama, in one single of his mandates, resorted to 6 times more drone strikes than George Bush during his administration. So the fact that drones were used notably in Afghanistan against Al-Qaeda, against the Taliban regime, also in Pakistan, we'll come back to this, because of some Taliban or some members of Al-Qaeda hiding in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, of course. The fact that they were used in Afghanistan and Pakistan against Al-Qaeda permits us to understand the reason why they were introduced in the Western armies. They have 2 advantages, actually. They have 2 advantages. They offer 2 main advantages when compared to manned aircraft, to planes operated by genuine pilots. First, they are more cost effective, and of course, they minimize the risk of the risk to the pilot's life. They are cost effective, ladies and gentlemen. I saw an argument consisting in saying that with the price of one F-35 air fighter jet produced by Lockheed Martin, for the price of one, you can buy 30 Predators. 30 Predators are not more costly, not more expensive than one single F-31 air fighter jet. So cost effective, and maybe more important, I quote American officers whose quote I found in different books, they save lives. They don't get hungry. They are not afraid. They don't forget their orders. And they don't care if the guy next to them has just been shot. They do, sum up, they do a better job than humans. They do a better job than humans, for instance. A long endurance drone can fly up to 40 long hours without getting tired or hungry or afraid. To put it differently, ladies and gentlemen, and I would like to quote here Grégoire Chamaillot's book, French researcher. His book was translated into English. Very, very good book. Drones permit to project a power, and maybe should we say military force, without projecting vulnerability. If there is one advantage of drones, it is the fact for drones to permit Western armies to project power without projecting vulnerability. As a matter of fact, drones are ballistic, that is to say long range, that is to say distant standoff systems. And they permit, therefore, to reduce the casualties among the attackers, in the attacking, in our case, Western army. First, because just as other standoff devices, missiles, artillery, aerial bombings, etc., a drone, of course, erects a distance between the attacker and the target. And in doing so, it cancels the risks of Western troops to be killed in action. A drone operator will never be killed in action because he operates his or her drone somewhere in Nevada and not in Afghanistan, Pakistan, etc. And second concrete advantage, this distinguishes drones from manned aircraft, as opposed to aerial bombings, as opposed also to aerial surveillance by spying planes. drones resolve the so-called Gary Powers problem. Gary Powers, ladies and gentlemen, was the pilot who was shot down with his U-2 spying plane in 1960 over Siberia, over the USSR territory. And he was made prisoner. He did not die. He was made prisoner. And of course, the Soviets, Khrushchev, went to the UN to criticize the US. You are spying on the USSR, etc., etc. It was the beginning of the second Berlin crisis, which escalated into the construction, the building of the Berlin Wall a bit later in 1961. The Americans said, no, we do not do that. And of course, since Gary Powers was made prisoner, Khrushchev had the proof of what he was saying. He had to prove that indeed Americans were spying with their U-2 spying planes, the Soviet territory. This risk nowadays no more exists because since there are no more pilots in drones, they cannot be shot down, they cannot be made prisoners of war. No more killed in actions, no more prisoners of war, which of course is a huge advantage of drones. A historical reminder here, ladies and gentlemen. Drones, their standoff bombing capacity is to some extent, but the latest stage of a centuries-old history of ballistic weapons evolution, aiming precisely at increasing the distance between the attacker and the target. The aim is to hit the enemy before, thanks to a distant bombing, before said enemy can reach the attacker. And drones, such as, just as missiles or aerial bombings, etc., use the combat tactics used by drones, privileged by drones, is called distant combat tactics or fire tactics, which we should distinguish from shock tactics or close combat tactics, which is characterized by definition by physical contact between the two contenders, the two warriors, the soldiers. In international relations theories, weapons are, this is notably the case of von Evera, Stephen von Evera, weapons are traditionally divided in offense-dominant weapons and in defense-dominant weapons. Offense-dominant weapons are illustrated by the sword. With a sword, you can attack and kill somebody. And defense-dominant weapons are illustrated symbolically by the shield. You can hardly kill someone. You cannot attack with a shield, but you do protect yourself. So it is a defense-dominant weapon. And of course, we can generalize this. A surface-to-air missile aiming at shooting down the plane is a defense-dominant weapon. A cruise missile or Hellfire missile launched against a target is an offense-dominant missile, offense-dominant weapon. If then we look at the category of offense-dominant weapons, well, they can be divided into those weapons which, in order to be efficient, need a close combat. It is the case of a sword, it is the case of a knife, of a bayonet, an axe, etc., etc. In previous centuries. To kill somebody, you must be close. You must engage in a physical struggle. You must be close to your opponent. Weapons concerned require their holders to engage physically with their opponent. And the opposite is true then with those weapons which permit to wage battles at long range because they are efficient from a distance. A firearm, for instance, already an arrow in the past, permits to kill at a distance without being afraid of being killed oneself, at least as long as the adversary does not possess the same equivalent weapon. In this case, two gunmen shooting at one another, though not physically close, nevertheless transform their long-distance combat into short, into a close combat, because each one can reach the other one with his or her gun. The history of weapon technology, ladies and gentlemen, since the Middle Ages, is a never-ending sequence of attempts to find weapons that give the attacker an advantage. It's a never-ending race between the sword and the shield, to some extent. The attacker always looks for an advantage, looks for the advantage of killing without running the risk of being killed. And this sequence, this historical process, somehow accompanies the evolution of army styles that we saw last week in our chapter 6. So very quickly, the most significant stages of this evolution. During the 100 Years' War, the English invented the longbow. The longbow permitted the English to kill the French warriors, the French soldiers, at least as long as these warriors did not possess the same weapon. The longbows permitted the English the English infantry to overrun the French cavalry. All the more so, the arrows launched by longbows were able to penetrate heavy cavalry's armor. Advantage to the English. They could kill from distance. They did not need to engage in a physical combat using swords and spears, which was the cavalry's weapon. So this infantry revolution, the introduction of longbows, complemented a bit later by the invention of crossbows, which are all the more so sophisticated longbows. This infantry revolution was followed by the so-called artillery revolution, and more specifically by the invention of cannons. The invention of cannons had an impact on siege warfare, which then characterized, remember we saw last week, there were hardly any pitched battles. First and foremost, warfare consists in siege warfare. That is to say, the different landlords, the different rulers had their castles, their fortifications, within which they try to protect themselves. So the invention of cannons changed this reality. Gunpowder used in cannons imported from China, introduced in cannons, permitted to destroy the thick walls of fortresses, castles. The medieval leaders, rulers, princes' castles were destroyed. And given that this revolution, of course, was based on money, only the richer noble men were able to acquire such costly weapons. And this, of course, contributes to explain the rise of territorial states. Territorial states governments ruled by one king who, thanks to his greater welfare, his greater richness, was able to acquire such cannons and also to pay mercenaries, we saw this last week, in order to handle these cannons on land. And this explains then gradually the end of the Middle Ages. Land fiefs held by the different landlords, the knights, the earls, the dukes, etc., and the emergence of a territorial state characterized by the monopoly of legitimate physical violence. And this territorial state transformed itself into our contemporary modern nation states. Cannons also had an impact on the seas, since they were used aboard ships, aboard warships. And more specifically, since given their heavy weight, new ships had to be invented and built, sailing ships. And the British were much more efficient in doing so than the Spaniards, and this contributes to explain why gradually the British were able to defeat the Spaniards towards the end of the 16th century, Queen Elizabeth I, thus permitting Great Britain to become the first naval power and to control the seven seas. Naval warfare was no longer based on assaults on ships coming close, permitting the sailors and the warriors to kill in close combats the enemy's soldiers. No, ships could be sunk from distance thanks to the bullets or the bombs launched by cannons. The artillery revolution had a second dimension, the gunpowder revolution, that is to say, a gun was introduced in smaller arms in handguns. And handguns, and first and foremost, the muskets used notably by the French musketeers, were introduced and replaced the crossbow, which I said this some minutes ago, had replaced or had complemented the long bow. Muskets permitted a range of 100 meters, and muskets themselves, of course, gradually were improved and were replaced by rifles. That is to say, firearms. The most famous of all rifles, maybe also due to Hollywood, is the Winchester rifle used by the American armies and the American cowboys when conquering the lands of the indigenous Indian tribes in the Wild West. We should add machine guns, and more specifically the Maxim gun, co-invention by British and Americans, used notably by the British in their colonial wars overseas. We come back to this. And last but not least, the Kalashnikov, invented by the Soviets. And the preferred weapon of nowadays guerrilla fighters, maybe of terrorists too, if not of various kinds of criminal networks. Of course, technology went on being improved, and so this explains the triumph nowadays of missile technology. Missiles nowadays are launched from ships, from submarines, from land bases, and also, of course, from aircraft. Missiles are the contemporary, and by drones too, of course. Missiles are the contemporary versions, the crowning stage of technologies permitting distant or standoff bombing, increasing the distance, of course, between the attacker and its target. You know that a submarine launched intercontinental missile or an aircraft launched intercontinental missile, it can reach whatever point, whatever target located at whatever point on the planet Earth. Admittedly, ladies and gentlemen, the competitive advantage of killing from a distance has been and still is short-lived by definition. That is to say, the advantage only exists as long as the party, the belligerent inventing a new weapon, has the monopoly of the weapon. Once other protagonists are able to acquire the same weapon, the advantage no longer exists. That said, the temporary advantage is nevertheless significant. It was true in the past. Just look at the Nazis inventing their specific tank, Panzer, which explains their capacity to overrun the French Maginot Line in 1940. It was temporary, but as long as it was existing, this advantage absolutely was crucial. And the same is true for drones nowadays. We come back to this. Drones were invented by technologically developed Western economies, or in technologically developed Western economies, though nowadays non-Western armies and even non-state actors start resorting to drones during a significant period. And at least as regards our imperial wars, our wars of choice here, there was a monopoly of Western armies. I come back to this. The Americans and the Israelis were the first ones to invent these drones, these weapon systems, permitting to wage offensive wars without any risk for the attacker. If the drone if then drones permit to wage wars without any risk for the attacker, they permit to undertake dangerous tasks. But more than merely dangerous tasks, drones also permit to undertake dull, deep, and dirty tasks. So we have these dangerous, deep, dull, and dirty, which are able, thanks to drones. Sometimes dangerous and deep are synonymous, so we can satisfy with the 3Ds: dangerous, dull, and dirty. Dull tasks. Regarding dull tasks, of course, it's an allusion to surveillance missions, surveillance tasks. Military surveillance is boring, it's physically demanding, it requires high levels of concentration, frequent breaks. If undertaken by men, by human beings, this is no more true. For drones, they do not get tired. They do not need breaks. They are not absent-minded during specific periods of time. And regarding dirty tasks, drones can operate in hostile environments, in battle zones characterized by bad weather conditions, or geographically hostile jungles or deserts, or filled with different weapons of mass destruction, notably biological ones or chemical weapons. So these dangerous, these dirty, these deep environments, of course, are likely to be found where, ladies and gentlemen, well, in non-Western regions of the world. And given these advantages, drones, I think, perfectly fit our Western imperial wars of choice. All the more so, drones were and still are, to some extent, monopolized by technologically developed armies, Americans notably, but also Israel. The fact for Western armies, Western powers to have both the financial richness and technological skills to develop drones, whereas the enemies do not possess these advantages, introduces, or maybe should I say consolidates, a hierarchical dimension among belligerents. A hierarchical dimension. Why? Because the wars concerned are asymmetrical wars, but asymmetrical in the meaning of favorable to Western armies. More specifically and more accurately, drones transform a war into a unilateral manhunt. Drone warfare is no more war strictly defined or classically defined. It turns into a unilateral manhunt. I would like to quote here George W. Bush. In a speech held in February 2003, that is to say, some 15 months after America launched its Operation Enduring Freedom against Al-Qaeda, Bin Laden, the Taliban in Afghanistan, and also 1 month or 6 weeks before, 1 month before launching Iraqi freedom against Saddam Hussein. Listen to George W. Bush. We are dismantling Al-Qaeda one person at a time. Slowly but surely, we are bringing them to justice. We are at war in a different kind of war. We are in a different kind of war. It's a war that requires us to be on an international manhunt. An international manhunt. We are on the hunt. It is a war that causes us to need to get the enemy on the run, to hunt an enemy on the run. And it's just a matter of time before we bring them to justice. George W. Bush, 2003. Listen now to Barack Obama, 2014, when deciding that America should intervene against ISIS in Syria. He dropped George W. Bush's policy consisting in sending American troops. He adopted the so-called light footprint strategy, that is to say, special operation, forces on the ground, but a small number, and first and foremost, distant bombing thanks to drones. Listen to Obama. We will hunt down terrorists who threaten our country, wherever they are. We will hunt them down wherever they are, that is to say, be they in Syria or Iraq or anywhere else. I will not hesitate to take action against ISIL or ISIS in Syria as well as Iraq. This is a core principle of my presidency, Obama. If you threaten America, you will find no safe haven. We will hunt you down. Drone strikes, ladies and gentlemen, do hunt terrorists who have staged attacks. But we could say genuinely terrorists. But they also, these drone strikes, target individuals known as members of networks close to really existing terrorists. Because of what? Because of their activities on internet, because of different traces or tracks that they leave on internet, on their smartphone, on their credit card, when they meet or when they talk to people considered to be terrorists. That is to say, there are drone strikes. There are two kinds of drone strikes. Personal strikes, hitting, targeting, and eliminating genuine terrorists, and signature strikes, which are preventive strikes, because they target possible, prospective, suspected terrorists before they undertook any kind of real attack. So drone strikes is more than merely eliminating adversaries. It is not necessarily, I quote Chamayu, a matter of responding to actual attacks. It is also a question of preventing the development of emerging threats. Thanks to what? Thanks to the elimination of potential future terrorists. This is an important point, ladies and gentlemen. If we come back to what we saw in our introduction, a war, according to Clausewitz, is a kind of a duel on an extensive scale. Remember the etymological origin of the Latin bellum. It comes from the Latin duellum. A war is a duel opposing two protagonists or two collective units. A war is composed by battles with an attacker attacking a target, and this target is likely to defend itself against the attacker. In order for a war to be a war, there must be an attack and a defense. There must be a reciprocal result to violence. Attack and counterattack. Attack, defense, and counterattack. War, to put it differently, and to use the Belgian philosopher Chantal Mouffe's expression, is an agonistic process. Agonistic, that is to say, it is a combat between equals, opposing two equivalent protagonists. Drone warfare puts an end to war as an agonistic process. Drone strike cannot respect the logic of two equivalent equal warriors. And maybe should I say, it does not want to respect this logic. Its aim is to bypass the logic of war as a duel. Why? Because the target, he or she who's about to be hit by a drone strike, of course, not merely cannot defend itself, but actually does not know, is not aware of she or he being about to be killed by a drone strike. To put it differently, ladies and gentlemen, I use once again the expression of Shamayu. Drone warfare is nano war. And that is to say, it is synonymous with a hunting whose aim is to put to death. To use drones, I use John Kagan Sarah Crabb's expression, amounts to proceed to a summary execution without trial, of course. And in doing so, ladies and gentlemen, contemporary drone to which Western liberal democracies resort revive imperial wars of the past for two reasons mainly. First of all, because just as contemporary wars fought with drones, past imperial wars were also one-sided killings. They were undertaken and fought thanks to the then colonial powers' technological advantage. They could intervene in overseas territories. Why? While the opposite was not true. Remember the expression of Victor Davis Hanson, England was in India. India was not in England. That is to say, anyone richer was likely to wage wars in the territory of anyone who was poorer or less developed or technologically less skilled. I would like to give a very concrete example. I mentioned the Maxim gun, and I said that it was notably used by the British in Great Britain's colonial conquests overseas. In the 1880s, the British used the Maxim gun in Sudan. The aim of the British was to control the territory from Cairo in Egypt to Cape Town in South Africa. So they launched different battles to conquer today's Sudan. And the Battle of Omdurman, the town concerned, in the 1880s, ended with the following death toll: 48 Anglo-Egyptian victims, because the British army resorted also to Egyptian mercenaries. Anglo-Egyptian victims amounted to 48. The Sudanese victims amounted to 10,000. 48 versus 10,000. So contemporary, and we will give some data in a few minutes regarding the victims caused by contemporary drone strikes, American drone strikes. Drone warfare, ladies and gentlemen, is somehow the contemporary crowning of the Western culture of carnage, to use Hansen, of the Western culture of slaughter. And second reason, when we look at imperial wars of the past, in the past too, when new weapons were invented, when they were introduced into warfare, and of course provoked a significant number of victims significantly higher than the weapons that had been used in the past, there were some critical or moral voices rejecting these new weapons, asking that they should not be used. It was the case of the crossbow, because the crossbow amplifies the wounds when compared to an arrow launched by a bow or even a longbow. It was the case of the red-hot cannonballs, that is to say, fireballs that were launched from sailing ships, warships, against other ships, in order to put them on fire, to set them on fire, and then they ended up, of course, sinking. And it was the case of expanding bullets, ladies and gentlemen. Expanding bullets that were used notably during World War I, but already earlier by the British again. In India, they were called dum-dum bullets because they were produced in specific part of the town, the city of Calcutta, called Dum Dum. So the expanding, the Dum Dum bullets were expanding bullets. That is to say, they were projectiles designed to expand on impact, and they produced, of course, a larger wound. This is the origin of what the French during World War I called les gueules cassées. These weapons, I come back to my point, were condemned morally when they appeared for the first time. But though being morally condemned, they were used. And where were they used? Well, they were used, authorized, legitimized, when used beyond the line. That is to say, in wars against those units that were not considered to be part of the community, the society, the civilization of those who invented them, in our case, the West. So crossbows were legitimate when used against the Muslims during the Crusades, the Arab Muslims. Red-hot cannonballs, the picture here with the naval battle of Lepanto, were considered to be legitimate when used by the Western Catholics, the Spaniards, the Venetians, against the Muslim Turks or Ottomans at the Battle of Lepanto. And Dum-Dum bullets, expanding bullets, were considered to be legitimate when used by the British to repress riots and revolts in the British Empire of India. So, drone warfare, just as past, new weapons consolidate the hierarchy between us and them. When fighting among Western units, we respect some moral principles, or try to do so. When fighting wars overseas against other units who do not share our vision, our beliefs, our convictions, our values, then we can use immoral weapons. We can use immoral weapons, all the more so everywhere. This is the last point of the advantage of drones, if we can consider this to be an advantage. Drones permit Western militaries to wage their manhunts, their unilateral manhunts, in an unlimited space. While drone operators are safe, invulnerable, because they operate their drones from a military base, for instance, somewhere in Nevada, terrorists are tracked wherever they may try to hide. There is no safe haven, to quote Obama, for terrorists. Borders no more exist. State sovereignty is an illusion. The whole world, to put it differently, and I quote Chamayo, the whole world is the battlefield. And maybe, should we say, and this is what Chamayo emphasizes, the whole world is the hunting ground where terrorists are likely to be. And the whole world becomes a kill box, or a set of little kill boxes, because the victims will be targeted and hit and eliminated wherever they try to hide. The proof is that America was at war against the Taliban, but since the Taliban and Al-Qaeda members fled to Pakistan, of course, the US also used drones in Pakistan, though not declaring any kind of war, not even implicitly, to Pakistan. We have here the list of drone strikes in Afghanistan, those strikes, and the victims on the bottom of the right part of the slide, here in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, sorry, here in Somalia, and here in Yemen. So the whole world is a kill box. Nowhere are terrorists or supposed terrorists or prospective terrorists likely to escape. the launching of a missile by a drone. Western statesmen and Western military officers, of course, are not disturbed by this kind of hierarchical, unequal relation with their enemies. The opposite is true, ladies and gentlemen. And the opposite is true. Why? Because Western liberal democracies emphasize actually what they consider to be the advantage, and should I say, the moral progress of using drones, the moral progress. Why? Because precisely drones permit targeted killings. That is to say, the number of casualties among the enemy is diminished. It is relatively lower, at least when compared to traditional bombings, be it missiles launched from planes or from warships, at least I would say up to roughly the 1990s. And all the more so, of course, the number of victims of drone strikes is very, very significantly lower than the number of victims of carpet bombings that were practiced, and notably during World War II, but also in the Korean War and in America's Vietnam War during the 60s and the 70s. A small number of victims are killed due to precision-guided smart weapons, given, to put it differently, the capacity to target, to precisely target those who will die. Of course, there are also civilians who are sometimes killed, and this then will be called collateral damage. Maybe you heard, ladies and gentlemen, that when the American troops were withdrawing from Afghanistan in August, at the end of August 2021, a terrorist attack took place, maybe staged by Al-Qaeda or ISIS anyway, and the Americans retaliated with a drone strike. And this drone strike was a botched drone strike. It killed 10 civilian Afghans. And the comment of an American officer was the following one. This was, I quote, "a honest mistake, a honest mistake." To put it differently, drone strikes have, according to Western armies, the advantage of diminishing the number of people killed. And when civilians are killed, it is a mistake, an honest mistake. It is a collateral damage. The problem with this moral progress, however, is that it has obviously a dark political side. And I here come once again back to Kant and the main theoretical or political argument of today's class. Since drone warfare lowers the number of victims both within the Western armies and among the enemies, it contributes to exclude these wars from any kind of serious public debate. Ladies and gentlemen, in our contemporary postmodern Western societies, to quote John Miller, war is no longer accepted by the huge majority of average citizens such as you and me. War is no more considered as a normal instrument of foreign policy, as the mere continuation of foreign policy by other means, to quote Clausewitz's definition of war. I quote John Miller. Nowadays, the book goes back to a bit more than 30 years. It was published at the very end of the 80s. War at that time already has been substantially discredited, I quote, as an effective method of foreign policy. Today, the physical and psychological costs of war are too high to resort to arms in order to do what? In order to achieve goals such as gain territory, establish dominance, expand trade, coerce an opponent, prevent secession, advance prosperity, stave off attack, replace regime, or promote an ideology or a religion. Today, to get rid of an opponent, to expand oneself, etc., is no longer pursued thanks to wars because of the too high physical and psychological costs. This claim was made a bit more than 30 years ago. It is no longer valid. Since drones no more don't kill anymore a high number of victims, a high number of enemies, well, the cost no longer appears too high by Western public opinions. And in Karg and Krebs's book, I found the following figure. Only in an opinion poll, in an American opinion poll, only 9%, 10% of American citizens criticized the use of drones abroad. Only 10%. While 60% of American citizens are opposed to using drones for domestic surveillance. To put it differently, Western citizens, ladies and gentlemen, supposed to be rational and therefore opposed to war, according to Kant, actually only think of their own freedom, their own life. So they don't want to be the targets of drones monitoring what they are doing in their everyday life. But when drones are used to kill terrorists overseas, 9 out of 10 are not disturbed at all by this reality. And therefore, we can understand that Western leaders do not hesitate to use these drones in order to successfully wage the wars. They use the drones all the more so. Drone warfare, when compared to the alternative means of foreign policy of conflict resolution, that is to say, diplomatic conflict resolution, well, drone warfare becomes rational. Rational in the meaning of Bueno de Mesquita's expected utility, a model that we saw in our introductory chapter. Remember Bueno de Mesquita's claim: a war is rational if it permits to obtain what diplomacy does not permit to obtain, very concretely, if it is more cost-effective than diplomacy. If it is more cost-effective than diplomacy. Now, since wars fought with drones do provoke no casualties or a limited number of casualties, no casualties among Western operators of drones, and a very low or a relatively low amount of casualties among adversaries, since it provokes no destruction, no devastation, the temptation to go to war against an enemy is increasing as compared to the advantage of a long diplomatic negotiation with someone which will start to bargain, etc., etc. It is attractive to go to war, and therefore drone warfare once again disconnects contemporary imperial wars from democratic societies. Since drones make it possible to wage wars without killing Western young men, the politicians do not need to build the consensus which should be present, according to Kant, before going to war. A war no longer requires to convince the majority of the public opinion, the majority of the elected representatives at the US Congress or the French Assemblée Nationale before going to war. To put it differently, ladies and gentlemen, drone wars, since they are somehow destruction-free wars, pervert the whole idea of a democratic process, the whole idea of citizenship when it comes to war. To decide to go to war somehow becomes a decision pretty similar to the decision, should we or should we not raise the freeway tolls, should we or not raise the age of retirement. It is a public policy decision similar to any kind of domestic public policy decision. It's no longer the decision which should, according to Kant, require the consent of the majority of rational citizens. And if I mentioned the US Congress or the French Assemblée Nationale, of course, it is because drone strikes are not at all controlled by those who are supposed, within the checks and balances system, those who are supposed to somehow control what the executive power is doing. Ladies and gentlemen, who decides which targets should be hit by drone strikes? In the US, it is the CIA. It is not the US Army. It is the CIA. The CIA establishes the kill list. And the activities of the CIA are not controlled by the US Congress. The kill list established by the CIA, ladies and gentlemen, is signed by the US president. Since there is no declaration of war, the US Congress does not intervene, does not check, does not control what the executive power is doing. In this case, the list, he or she, prospectively, is signing. Obama signed the kill list every Tuesday afternoon. And it so happens, ladies and gentlemen, that President Johnson, during the Vietnam War, when he decided which targets should be bombed in Vietnam, also took this decision a Tuesday afternoon. To put it bluntly and to sum up this point, the last point in today's lecture, the democratic system of checks and balances no longer exists. In Western democracies, imperial wars fought, notably with drones. Nowadays, imperial wars are no more checked by our elected representatives, and all the less so by the public opinion. And this is one of the reasons why precisely they are to be considered as imperial wars. They are decided, ladies and gentlemen, by, in the US, an imperial president. In France, by a president profiting from what the French called the domaine réservé. John Locke called this the prerogative of the executive power. Hobbes called it the sovereign representative. The representative is sovereign, that is to say, he is no longer accountable. Wars nowadays, imperial wars, our Western liberal imperial wars are fought, are decided, are launched by what we may call an untamed prince, to allude to Machiavelli's Prince. We will see, ladies and gentlemen, this absence of any democratic checks and balances when it comes to decide to go to war in our chapter 8 next week. Thank you very much for attending today's lecture. I hope you will be back next week. I wish you a great day and see you pretty soon. Goodbye.